Okay, now let's talk about floating elements. This is another technique for positioning elements and creating layouts. So let's say we want to display a tweet. What HTML element can we use to represent a tweet? We can use the article element, because with the article, we can represent any independent, self-contained piece of content. So we're going to have an article. We can give it a class of tweet for styling. Now, inside this article, we're going to have an image and some text. In this lesson, I'm not going to use an image to keep things simple. Instead, we're going to use a div with the class of avatar. Next to that, we're going to have a paragraph with some dummy text. Okay. Now let's define some styles. So I'm going to define a rule for the class of avatar and give it a width of 5 rem, a height of 5 rem, and a background color of gold. Now here I'm using a relative unit. So if the default text size changes, our image also resizes accordingly. All right, now let's see what we get. So here's the result. Our paragraph element is appearing on a new line because paragraphs are block level elements. And as you know, block level elements begin on a new line. Now, to put this paragraph next to the avatar, we're going to use the float property. So here we're going to set float to left, and this will float the avatar element to the left side of its container. And as a result of that, all the subsequent elements will flow around it. Take a look. So our avatar element is pushed to the left side of its container, which is the tweet, and our paragraph is flowing around it. Now back to our markup, let's add a paragraph with some more text. Let's say 50 words. See what's happening? Our text is flowing around the image or the avatar. This is how floats work. Now currently our text is so close to the avatar. What CSS property should we use to space them? The margin property, right? So here we can apply a right margin to the avatar or a left margin to the paragraph. Because we already have a rule for the avatar class, I would prefer to apply a right margin here as opposed to defining another rule for paragraph elements. So here we can set margin right to 0.5 rem. Once again, I'm using a relative unit, so if the text size changes, the space also adjusts accordingly. We could also use pixels here, like 10 pixels. There is no right or wrong. So we have some space between the avatar and the paragraph. Great. Now we can also float elements to the right side of their container. So if we set float to right, now our avatar is pushed to the right side of its container. And just like before, the paragraph elements are flowing around it. Now let's set this back to left. Here's what we get. Now, there are situations where we don't want the second element here to flow around the floated element. Maybe here we have a link or an icon for replying to this tweet, liking it, or retweeting it. We want all these icons to appear right below the tweet. So how can we push this paragraph below the avatar? This is where we use the clear property. So here we're going to define another class called clear. We could call it anything. The name doesn't matter. In this class, we set the clear property to left because we have an element that is floated to the left. If our element was floated to the right, we had to set the clear property to right. Okay? Now there is another value. We can set this to both. So if you have elements that are floated to the left or to the right, this will clear all of those floats. In fact, a lot of people prefer to set clear to both because this way we don't have to remember the direction of floats. Okay? Now we're going to apply this class to our second paragraph element. So back to the markup. Let's set the class to clear. Take a look. Our second paragraph is below the image or the avatar. So this is how floated elements work. Now there is a problem with floats called parent collapsing, which means parent elements don't see floated elements and they collapse. Let me show you what I mean. Back to our style sheet, I'm going to define a rule for our tweet and give it a border of 3 pixels, solid, light gray. So everything looks fine now, but let's see what happens if we remove the second paragraph. So here's the second paragraph, delete. Now, see what happened? Our parent element, which is the article with the class of tweet, has collapsed. Now it only contains this paragraph element. So it's not containing the avatar because avatar is a floated element. And by default, parent elements don't see floated elements. They're invisible to them. So in this case, our parent element has gotten tall enough just to contain this paragraph. if we remove this paragraph, our parent element will collapse even more. Let me show you. So I'm going to delete this paragraph. Now, see, all we see now is just the border of the parent element because there is nothing inside the parent element. So how can we solve this problem? Well, we have a couple of different solutions. First, let's bring the paragraph back. Now, one way to solve this problem is to add an empty div at the end of this container to clear the float. So here we can add a div with the class of clear, and this solves the problem. So pretty much whenever we use floats, we have to clear after. Otherwise, we run into weird layout issues. So this is one way, but there's a problem with this approach. This div is not meaningful or descriptive to search engines and screen readers because we have purely added this div to solve a layout issue. So our HTML markup is not semantic. That is the problem with this approach. There is another way to solve this problem. We can use pseudo elements. So earlier we talked about before and after pseudo elements. With these pseudo elements, we can add content before or after the content of an element. So we can remove this div, go back to our style sheet, and write a new rule like this. Tweet after. So we want to insert an element after the content of the tweet element. Here we're going to set the content property to just a pair of quotes, which means no content. We can use single or double quotes, it doesn't matter. Now this element by default is an inline element. So here we have to use the display property to convert it to a block level element, just like a div. And then we set clear to both. So with this code, we're essentially adding that div dynamically without polluting our markup with non-semantic elements, okay? So take a look. We get the same result as before. Now, what if we have used a floated element somewhere else on this page, but outside of a tweet? Let's say we have an element for displaying an advertisement. So we might have a class called add. To solve the floating issue, we would have to use after pseudo element selector one more time and repeat all these styles. This is bad. We don't want duplication in our code. So what we can do here is we rename this class to something more general, something more reusable. We can call this clear or clear fix. That's a common name a lot of people use. Some people call it CF, but you shouldn't use abbreviations because they make your code hard to read. So let's call it clear fix. Now, we go back to our markup and apply a second class to our article element. So after tweet, we type clear fix. So an element can have multiple classes separated by a space. Now, let's take a look. The problem is fixed. So this is another way to solve this problem. Now there is a third way. We can use the overflow property. So I'm going to remove the clear fix class. Now, back to our tweet. Here we're going to set the overflow property to any value other than visible. We can set it to auto, but the problem with auto is that sometimes depending on how we have laid things out, you might end up getting scroll bars. Alternatively, we can set this to hidden. But as you know, with hidden, sometimes our content may get clipped. So overflow is not really the best way to solve this problem, even though it works. So if we go back to the browser, see, the problem is solved and we didn't have to clear the float. To be quite honest with you, I haven't used the overflow property to solve this problem because this is what we call a hack, which means a dirty solution. So overall, floats are a bit hard to work with. We have to deal with parent collapsing. We have to clear floats after. That's why you shouldn't use floats to build layouts. We used floats in the past when we didn't have tools like Flexbox and Grid. So going forward, to create layouts, you should use Flexbox or Grid. But I know there are still millions of websites out there that are using floats, and you might be maintaining one of these websites. So that's why I included this lesson in this course, so you understand how floats work. Next, we're going to talk about Flexbox.